housefly, Musca domestica. The seemingly benign creature clings to almost every wall and every facade, and eludes discovery of even the most meticulous observer. At this very moment, it bides its time to wait, as it watches you from some unknown corner in your room, until the time of your death, when the fly is your new master, as it feasts on the flesh of your rotting corpse.
In June 1972, a 23-year-old autistic gas station mechanic from Galveston named Michael Self was asked to speak to police regarding the disappearance of two local teenage girls. He went in voluntarily for questioning, and 24 hours later he had confessed to both of their murders. Self was a convicted sex offender with an estranged marriage and pedophilic attractions, but he wasn't a murderer. He hadn't killed anyone. He confessed to the murders because two sheriff's deputies spent hours torturing, beating, and threatening to kill him if he didn't. The deputies beat Self with a club for hours to get a confession because the bodies of 8 young women, missing from Houston to Galveston, had all turned up within the marshes of the small Gulf town of League City over the past 2 years without a single lead. Self was convicted in September 1974, by which a 9th body had been found and more still were missing, and proved to be only the first chapter of the bloodiest murder grounds in modern Texas history. Within this video, and in the cases of many of the victims here, the term killing fields is used to refer to two different things, both the larger area around the town of League City, Texas, and a smaller, more concentrated plot of land in town known as Calder Road Oil Field. The Texas Killing Fields ranks as the 5th largest body dump in America, areas both general and specific used by one or more perpetrators to dispose of murder victims. As of the most recent body discovered in 2006, 30 victims have been claimed by the fields here. The suspected list of men responsible is more than half the length of the list of victims. Every single victim has been female. Nearly every single one endured some form of sexual assault before death. To avoid going into detail in each individual case, I want to make the following abundantly clear. The Texas Killing Fields are not some of America's other notorious body dumps, like Baltimore's Leakin Park or New York's Pelham Bay, where gangs and mobs dump bodies from hits. The killings here were centered almost solely, entirely around the kidnapping, rape, and murder of young women. Most of the women in this documentary suffered not only some of the most brutal deaths, but some of the most unthinkable sexual violations imaginable. There are details that, even if I could include them here on YouTube, I don't think I'd have the stomach to. This is the real-life South Texas town scarred by 3 decades of violence. The marshes of the Texas Gulf Coast eat bodies, but their stories shouldn't be lost to time. This video is a glimpse of what it's like to stand in the mud pits of Calder Road oil field, the most notorious dumping ground of the killing fields, and into just a few of the stories of the people who ended up here, and why. In August of 1997, a pickup truck belonging to 17-year-old Jessica Kane is found by her father, abandoned in the dead of night off the shoulder of Interstate 45 South. The fear inside him comes quick. Like everyone else here, he knows what happens to young girls who go missing in League City. The search effort is massive and immediate, and this time the frustration boils over. As the sun rises over the Gulf, a mob of nearly 200 people descends on a privately owned plot of land in the southwest corner of town, searching for her remains. The owner of the land has never been so much as arrested for a crime, but his reputation in the eyes of the town is inescapable. The town knows he has killed before, and every time another person goes missing, all eyes turn to him. And people go missing a lot down here. The mob finds nothing. Jessica Kane is the fifth young woman to disappear within 2 years, and her body will not be discovered until 2016, when serial killer William Lewis Reese leads police to her remains after being captured. Reese is at least the third serial killer in the killing field's history, although serial killers were far from the only players in the cases here. The 1990s alone saw 6 kidnappings, sexual assaults, and murders committed by 5 different people. And that's nothing compared to the 70s. A road rage in the late 80s led to a murder and a body still missing to this day. 2 teenage friends, last seen together and found dead together, but potentially killed by 2 different people. A 15-year-old hitchhiker from Connecticut, found dead in the fields just a month after leaving home. The number of kidnapping victims never found is 3 times the number of cases that have resulted in convictions. The oldest victim was 57, while the youngest just 12 years old, and the majority of the victims were under 20. On the edge of Calder Road oil field, a wooden cross leans against the telephone pole. It was placed by Tim Miller, who says that he has woken up every single morning since 1986, wondering about the last moments of his 16-year-old daughter's life. Miller once rented a bulldozer and a team of search dogs, and spent hours with a group of friends tearing through the field in the mid-90s, searching for clues to his daughter's murder and the slayings of 3 other women in the same field. He was also one of the 200 people that stormed the property next door, searching fruitlessly for Jessica Kane a few years later. While Kane's killer would eventually land behind bars, Laura Miller's wouldn't. She is far from alone. Still today, after time has moved on and League City has grown and expanded since the grisly murders, more than a handful of families haven't. The following is not a disparagement against the Galveston County Sheriff's Office, or at least it didn't start out as one. It's the true story of the real consequences that happen when an incompetent law enforcement agency doesn't care about its job and lets a madman terrorize a county of women for a decade. While a pair of Galveston County Sheriff's deputies beat a man in a holding cell that they knew was innocent, it's possible that the first real murderer of the killing fields was sitting in a chair down the hall in the very same building for a different charge. His name is Edward Harold Bell, and he truly is one of the most despicable human beings imaginable. Unlike some of the other suspects on this list, Bell made no attempt to hide his twisted personality whatsoever, and apparently he didn't have to, seeing as he was arrested 12 times in Galveston for exposing himself to children in public, and walked out of the police station every single time. Bell ran a surf shop in Galveston during the 1970s, where 2 of his frequent teenage customers mysteriously turned up dead in a League City bayou. Bell also owned a house in Dickerson, just outside of League City, and just down the road from where 2 more teenage girls turned up dead. Despite all of this, Bell was never really considered in serious contention for the murders in the area throughout most of the 70s, and the closest he would come to handcuffs would be a few psychiatric sessions in order to drop his public exposure charges. In 1978, while Bell fondled himself on a street corner in front of a group of teenagers, a 26-year-old former Marine named Larry Dickens attempted to intervene and call the police. And in response, Bell shot and killed him point blank. He was arrested, let out on bail, and never showed up to his hearing. I can't with these people. In 1984, a man matching Bell's description broke into a house outside of College Station and stabbed an unnamed woman inside. Grabbing the gun on her nightstand, the woman successfully chased Bell out of her house and survived, and later recognized Bell's picture in a newspaper as the man who attacked her. Sometime soon after this, Bell fled Texas to Panama, where he hid for almost 10 years until his capture and extradition in 1994. Apparently, that was finally enough to keep him behind bars, and once he realized he was facing life in prison, he truly began to confess to his atrocities. Bell painted a twisted picture of wrath as he struggled to remember more than half of the names of his victims, killing 5 girls in 1971 and 6 more between 1973 and 77. Yes, if you did the math there, that means that Bell admitted to killing 5 women in 1971 alone, and that wasn't even the total death toll of the killing fields in that year. The simultaneous sexual assaults and deaths of friends Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson, the 7th and 8th victims in 1971, apparently drew no suspicion to the surf shop that they frequented, whose owner was well on his way to clocking a fucking baker's dozen of public exposure to minors. In 1973, after a lull following his tumultuous 71, Bell murdered his oldest victim, Kimberly Pitchford, 16 years old, last seen at her driving test. In 1976, Brooks Bracewell and Georgia Greer's remains were found in a ditch west of League City near Bell's property, but due to police mismanagement and neglect, their remains wouldn't be identified until 5 years later because, it's easy to lose track of the dead bodies of 2 14-year-olds, I guess. Also in 1976, fun fact, the 2 Galveston sheriff's deputies that tortured the false confession out of Michael Self were arrested for multiple bank robberies in the Texas City area. Just thought that was interesting. The broad daylight shooting of Larry Dickens would mark Edward Bell's estimated 12th and final murder. He would never officially be charged with any of the murders of the victims of the killing fields, as he was already facing life in prison and could produce no physical evidence other than his word. For this part of the video, I set out to try and answer a 2-part question. Why here? Specifically, why League City and why Calder Road, the most infamous dumping ground of the killing fields? Please keep in mind that this is largely my own theorizing and speculation based off of research of the fields and geographical data, and doesn't explain all of the factors at play, just a few details I noticed. A hugely important thing to remember here is that many of the victims and almost none of the suspected killers were actually from League City. The catalyst for the killing fields and the fate of League City didn't lie within the city itself, it lied within its neighbors, Houston and Galveston. For those that don't know, Houston and Galveston have both long been plagued with a troubled history of violent crime, murder, poverty, and particularly during the height of the killing fields, a higher than average rate of sex offenders. Houston is the 4th largest city in America, with the highest crime rate of any major city in Texas, while Galveston's beachside glory days of speakeasies and casinos have long since faded, and where today nearly 1 in 4 of its 50,000 residents live below the poverty line. For the first part of the question, why League City, I want to draw a comparison back to one of the other top 5 body dump sites from earlier, Baltimore's Leakin Park, home to roughly 80 bodies discovered since 1968. It's a place that locals call the city's open-air cemetery, a 1,200-acre, heavily wooded nature preserve, the largest within the limits of any major city on the East Coast. Notice the words, within city limits. Look at how much green is within the city limits of Baltimore, a city of 609,000, versus Houston with over 2 million people. The comparison is abysmal. Leakin Park isn't just massive, it's heavily forested, dense, accessible, And most importantly, it's in Baltimore. Here you don't have to drive out of the city to dump a body without being seen, because there's a forest just down the block. Houston, however, a long-time prime example of horrible urban planning, doesn't have a Leakin Park or nearly as much secluded park and nature space within the city. The closest thing within the city in terms of size would be Memorial Park, which certainly isn't body dumping level sketchy, and the area around Attucks Park just past the west edge of the city. You know, the one with the 26-lane freeway running through the middle of it, although that hasn't stopped some of the suspects from the killing fields using Attucks Reservoir either. Houston, especially with a swelling population over 3 times that of a place like Baltimore, simply doesn't have the open-air nature space inside the city to support something like the killing fields. Instead, a killer living in Houston had 2 options: find someone local and drive them out of town, or drive out of town and find someone closer to an ideal dumping ground. Either way required them to pick a direction out of the city to take their business, and when it came to burying bodies, the closer to the Gulf, the better. On the other side of the causeway, Galveston proved to be an eerily similar case to Houston, a city with a high crime rate and a concerningly high number of sex offenders in a town without enough room. The nature of being a small but well-populated island makes hiding anything difficult, let alone a dead body. Bolivar Peninsula, a long and mostly empty strip of land to the east, would be perfect if it weren't for the ferry needed to cross the East Bay. So, anyone with a body to dispose of or who searched for victims outside of town headed north on I-45 over the causeway, and once the interstate hit mainland and wound through a few bogs and refineries, the first town it hit was League City.
Most car drivers are considerate of bicyclists, but then there are some who are not. Are you one of the bad guys? Without courtesy, there can be no safety. Let's share the road with our two-wheeled friends.
Three miles from Calder oil field, a Valero sits on the corner of Hobbs and Main Street, just off the interstate. On the evening of October 10th, 1983, a 23-year-old bartender named Heidi Villarreal Fry is seen outside the gas station using a payphone, before disappearing without a trace. A search discovers her remains 6 months later, after a local dog dug up a fragment of her skull and brought it home. Fry is the 15th female victim in a string of kidnappings from Houston to Galveston, found in is what now the 10th different location around the area of League City. Calder Road oil field, a marshy scrap of land abandoned before it was ever developed by the refineries in town, and named for the nearby road a stone's toss from I-45. Like many of the previous body dump spots, it is marshy, humid, and unassuming. It's another body, found just feet from where Heidi Villarreal Fry was discovered. 16-year-old Laura Miller, another League City native missing for 5 months. She is half sunken into the ground with her arms folded over her chest, same as Fry. Barely 24 hours later, detectives searching for clues around Laura Miller's body instead find another one, less than 100 feet away. This time, the marshes of Calder had done their job, dissolving and consuming the body of all identifiable traces beyond a female in the ballpark of 30 years old with a bullet in the back of her skull. She is dubbed Jane Doe and estimated that she had been lying in the field anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months. Her real name will not be revealed for 33 years. A retroactive poring over their missing persons reports reveals that Laura Miller was last seen at the same Valero gas station as Heidi Villarreal Fry, using the same payphone. It is the only clue that police will ever be given regarding their disappearances, and after seemingly clearing the employees of the station, it leads them nowhere. The FBI later describes Calder as a killer's personal graveyard, believing that all 3 of the murders were attributed to one person. One investigator described how the close layout of the bodies almost resembled a walking path, as if the killer had intentionally laid them so to peruse his trophies one by one. The answer to why Calder, why this specific sunken field on the edge of town, isn't so much the place itself, but rather the person behind it. While the killer responsible for the bodies here hails in comparison to Edward Bell, Calder gained more infamy at the time of the killings and would go on to be the most notorious ground of the killing fields, partly due to a more attentive and public police investigation, and partly because Calder was the only spot of the fields to be given such a personal touch by its killer. The ground here looks solid. It's not. The whole field is like this, by the way. The road through Calder is so caked in mud and sunken into the earth that I actually worried about driving too deep into it and getting stuck. In the background, the roar of the interstate is present, but it's less than you'd expect for how close it is. It was a quote from the Killing Fields dramatization that first drew me into this place. You can actually see the refineries that are in the south end of League City. You can see I-45. But if you yelled, no one would necessarily hear you. And if you ran, there wouldn't necessarily be anywhere to go. If you look close, you can see the scars of old tire tracks are carved through here. So this right here is just a dirt access road. The actual Calder Road is behind this tree line right here. It's Calder and then I-45. This is Everett Street, which has existed since the 70s but has since been repaved. And all of those suburbs over there are new. So this just used to be middle of nowhere. Standing there looking at it, it didn't feel like part of the 5th largest body dump in the United States, but it also didn't feel normal. Something was off about the fields. Recently, over 30 years after the tragedies here, the land around Calder has been developed on every side into new suburban neighborhoods. But the land here still sits untouched. I had to wonder, did the developers here tell their investors what they were building next to? There's a brand new Calder Road Elementary School just down the street. Do the people here know what lies in their backyard? Would you want to know?
Sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
I didn't kill those girls. I wouldn't know how to kill. 14 years before the disappearance of Heidi Villarreal Fry, the city of Houston celebrates a night like no other. The team at NASA has just successfully landed the first man on the moon, and one of the engineers who made it possible is a young Robert Abel. A third-generation Texas native from a small town near Austin, he is soft-spoken, quick-witted, and brilliant at what he did. In 1983, Abel moved from Houston to League City, where he continued work for NASA while leasing pasture land on the edge of town. In 1990, he married for the 3rd time and purchased a small plot of land directly adjacent to Calder to create Stardust Trail Rides, a small horseback trail riding business to run in his retirement, and to give kids an opportunity to learn to ride like he did on his home ranch as a child. Life was good for a year, until Calder turned up another body. On a hot September afternoon in 1991, Abel fell squarely into the investigation of the unidentified Janet Doe, not as a suspect, but instead as a volunteer who even let police borrow his trail ride horses to plow through the marshes. But like the second body in Calder, the marsh had eaten the victim alive, and the body could not be identified. Detectives still had no clues to go off of, so instead, they began asking Abel questions. Abel immediately felt betrayed and stormed out of the interrogation room. After a 3rd divorce and interviews with his 2 recent ex-wives spinning tales of anger episodes and animal abuse, Police spent 2 years building a case to search his house. They had no physical evidence, but told the courts that Abel checked off a disturbing number of serial killer checklist boxes. They got their warrant and found nothing in his house, but by then, the word was out and the town had decided. People avoided him in public, and Stardust trail rides closed for good. The case against Abel never truly amounted to more than, based on a list of serial killer tendencies, he could be a serial killer. But the feelings of uneasiness transcended the police and FBI reports on him. On a dark night in 1994, in a scene that Abel says never happened, Tim Miller, Laura Miller's father, claims he drove to Abel's house and put a gun to his head in the front yard. "I was about to pull the trigger when I realized that it wouldn't have mattered," Miller said. There was nothing on his face, no fear, no emotion, nothing. He had no conscience. Later in 2013, a 50-year-old prisoner named Mark Stallings gave an interview to KHOU 11 where he publicly confessed to the murder of the fourth woman discovered at Calder in 1991. Stallings claimed he never knew the woman's name, but rather picked her up on the night of the murder and described her as drugged and malnourished from a motel off the side of Interstate 610 in Houston. Letters of confessions exchanged over the course of several years between Stallings and a fellow inmate mentioned the victim multiple times, and from his cell he was able to produce a map leading directly to Calder. However, League City detectives revealed that Stallings had also confessed to the murder in 2001, but that some of the details in his confession 12 years earlier didn't match his new story. Either way, Stallings only claimed the fourth murder in 1991, leaving the first 3 still unsolved. As for why he chose Calder, the question has never been answered. League City had a lot of marshy back roads and a lot of sick, twisted men roaming down them. It wasn't impossible that Stallings had coincidentally dumped the body in the same spot as another killer for the same reasons, or seen the news stories about the other bodies discovered at Calder and decided to use the spot for himself.
How can I help you? I think I know something about a girl that's missing in Galveston County. Uh-huh. What's her name? Shelley Sykes.
The man on the phone is John King, calling from a motel room in town. Over the phone, he tells the dispatcher that a year prior, he and a friend, Gerald Zwarst, had kidnapped and murdered a 19-year-old from Galveston named Shelley Sykes. King expressed extreme suicidal desires as the reason for turning himself in, and he was picked up in his El Paso motel room without incident. Zwarst was also arrested, and together their stories were spilled. Shelley Sykes, who had graduated high school the year earlier as Yearbook's best personality, worked at Gladio's restaurant on the beach in Galveston. A year before the phone call on May 25, 1986, her car had been found lodged in the mud on the I-45 access road outside of Galveston, just before the bridge that crossed the Galveston Causeway. The driver's side window had been shattered, and blood not belonging to Sykes had been found on her dashboard. Multiple witnesses said that a brown Chevrolet pickup truck stopped alongside the car and that a young woman got in the truck, although those on site later disagreed whether the men in the truck were helping the girl or forcing her in. What led to the scuffle on the dark interstate is unknown. Zwarst was high on PCP in the passenger seat at the time, and King admitted to driving erratically and looking to pick a fight. When Sykes apparently flipped King the finger in retaliation to something, he responded by running her off the road completely. After she crashed, Sykes was taken into the men's truck, violated in the back seat, and killed. Or at least, they thought they killed her, until the pile of dirt that they had just buried started moving. They beat it with a shovel until it stopped. In prison, both men attempted to lead police to the body in exchange for reduced sentences, but their directions only raised more questions. King's location, near his house, produced nothing. Zwarst led police to a different location where Sykes' blouse was discovered, but still no body. To this day, she has never been found. For small towns in America, the curse of becoming a serial killer's stalking grounds is one of the worst fears a community can face. League City had 3. William Lewis Reese, the final mass killer of the fields, started with much of his work in Oklahoma, but killed twice in the League City area. Jessica Kane and 12-year-old Laura Smitter, found in a retention pond north of town. But among the intertwining trails of systematic killings, singular kidnappings and murders like King and Zorst's were also disturbingly common. In addition to Sykes, 2 other kidnappings in the area of Sandra Raymer and Suzanne Richards would never lead to a body, and neither matched the patterns of any of the 3 serial killers or each other. Neither would be solved. On March 5, 1996, 13-year-old Crystal Jean Baker would become the only victim in the area to be found on the same day of her murder. She was last seen using a payphone to call her family in Texas City, and just 2 hours later was found under an Interstate 10 bridge near the Louisiana border. In 2009, 45-year-old Kevin Smith was arrested on an unrelated charge in Louisiana and confessed after his DNA matched the scene of her murder. Most of the seemingly one-off murders have never been solved. Most, unfortunately, never will be. In the heart of the marshlands, a final killer lurks. It touches every part of the fields, from Galveston to Houston, a winding web of twisted death. Its tentacles wrap through towns, and its call never goes silent. A killer whose namesake is mentioned in every single case.